everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Education Commissioner of the State's Partnering for Success webinar. It's really great to see people from so many different places, organizations, and roles who are joining us today. Your participation in these webinars are critical because it really helps us enrich discussions about some of the most important education policy topics we have in this country. I'm Claus von Zastrow. I'm Senior Policy Director at Education Commission of the States, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today and also to guide you through our session. ECS's Partnering for Success webinars are designed to enhance everybody's ability to address key challenges in state education policy. And so today we're really addressing one of those very important challenges, and in fact, a very important topic. As most of you know, on January 29th, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which we also call the nation's report card, was released to provide national and state level results about students' performance in 4th and 8th grade reading and mathematics. You'll hear more about this in a minute, but it's important right now to say that the report provides the only national benchmark for how states' students are performing. It's also one of the only resources we have that allows us to measure these kinds of trends over time, really over decades. And that can help state leaders explore the impact of their policy decisions. And those are decisions that affect education for millions of students. This topic is near and dear to our hearts here at ECS because we've been with the National Assessment of Educational Progress since the beginning. In 1967, ECS began overseeing the development and administration of NAEP, which is what the acronym for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and we oversaw it for the next 15 years. So it's something that's always been one of our most important touchstones for work in education policy. Now, we have an incredible lineup of panelists today, state policymakers who are deeply invested and involved in improving education in their states. And they're going to give us a sort of on-the-ground perspective for what the results really mean for their efforts to ensure universally excellent education for the children of their, respective states. But first, I want to hand things off to our first speaker, Lesley Muldoon, who's the Executive Director of the National Assessment Governing Board, which oversees the nation's report card. And then before we get to our panel, Lesley's going to spend a few minutes talking about NAEP and this year's results. And so with that, Lesley, I'm handing the virtual podium to you.
Thank you so much, Claus. It is such a pleasure to be here this afternoon with all of you. Thank you so much for having me. As Claus mentioned, I lead the National Assessment Governing Board, which is an independent, nonpartisan board created by Congress to set policy for the nation's report card. Our board is comprised of state and local policymakers, educators, and stakeholders from around the country who set the vision for the nation's report card and help ensure it remains the independent gold standard measure in K-12 student achievement. Claus did me a great favor in covering some key information about what NAEP is on the next slide, so I will breeze right through it, but I do want to underscore a couple of things that he mentioned. The NAEP has been measuring K-12 student achievement in this country for 50 years. And so we have data that goes back decades and for generations of students, which is critically important as we try to understand how our children are doing academically and whether and where progress is occurring. The program is authorized and funded by Congress, and it's the only nationally representative and comparable data on student academic achievement and progress in reading, math, science, U.S. history, and civics. And as you all know, you have your own state tests with your own standards, and only NAEP will allow you to compare your progress with other states and over time. Many of your states have used NAEP, and hopefully more of you are doing this now, in particular with the newest report card, to help inform policy, shining a light on academic outcomes for different student groups, asking important questions about what is working and what may not be working, and informing the public about how your school systems are supporting students. It's legislative session in many of your states right now, so I do know we see in the clips and we see in conversations that the nation's report card is being used by leaders across the country to help make the case for different education policy initiatives and to help provoke conversations about what changes or what updates might be needed to make sure that students are achieving at their very best. So now let's dig into the data. Many of you may have seen the headlines last week when the report card was initially released. I'm going to talk about it in a couple of different ways. So this slide that you see right here shows you the overall national trends for students in 4th and 8th grade, reading and mathematics. Reading is on the left and math is on the right. And you can see these trend lines go all the way back to the early 1990s when the current NAEP assessment began, when we began administering it both at the national level and to all 50 states. So the big picture here is that students overall in 4th and 8th grade have not recovered from the disruptions of the pandemic. Compared to 2022, scores are down in reading by 2 points in both 4th and 8th grade. In mathematics, it's a little bit of a different story. We see that scores ticked up by 2 points in 4th grade math, which is great news. And in 8th grade, scores remained flat between 2022 and 2024. In 8th grade math, in the last time we reported results in 2022, this was the subject and grade level at which results were most concerning, where the decline was the biggest. And so this flat scores between 22 and 24, while not terrible news, is not great. We would hope to see more progress in 8th grade mathematics. When you step back and you think about the longer term here, there's two things that I would point out in particular. First is that you can see the reading trend lines over time remained relatively stable, right? There's not been a ton of movement up or down at the national level in reading until about 2017, when we started to see scores decline at the national level. In mathematics, by contrast, you can see there's been significant progress over time, particularly in 4th grade math, until we got to about 2017, 2019. The second thing I would point out is that when you look at scores for today's 4th and 8th graders in reading, those average scores are not significantly different from where students were performing in 1992 when this assessment was first given. In mathematics, average scores for students in 4th and 8th grade are significantly higher than they were in 1990. So you see just different pictures at the national level when it comes to reading and mathematics. Now I want to talk about the assessment results in the context of achievement levels. You all have achievement levels on your state assessments, but I want to give a little bit more detail about what this means in the context of NAEP. What are the knowledge and skills that most students performing at each achievement level can demonstrate? So we have some examples here for mathematics. We have, on the NAEP assessment, we have 3 levels: the NAEP Basic, the NAEP Proficient, and the NAEP Advanced. And NAEP Proficient is an ambitious bar. It is a high bar, and we believe that's critically important to ensure that our nation's students are able to perform at high levels, the levels they need to be successful in their futures, and levels that represent the knowledge and skills they're going to need in the future workforce. So here's some examples from the math assessment. 4th graders who perform at the NAEP Basic level, you could expect that they would be able to locate whole numbers on a number line. In 8th grade, you would expect that students scoring at the NAEP Basic level can simplify expressions involving integers. If you move to the other side of the screen, you can see some examples for NAEP Advanced. And this is a really challenging level. 4th graders at NAEP Advanced can compare and order whole numbers, fractions, and decimals to the 100th place, whereas 8th graders can solve complex problems using area, composing and decomposing complex figures. So those are sort of the two ends of the spectrum. I want to focus on the NAEP Proficient bar because that is our goal, right? We think it's really important to maintain high expectations for our children. And as you can see here, 4th graders who score at the NAEP Proficient level, you could expect them to be able to add and subtract multi-digit whole numbers, fractions, and decimals in both single and multi-step problems. Whereas 8th graders, you would expect to be able to apply the Pythagorean theorem to solve problems like the one you see here on your screen. The underlying point here is that students performing at the NAEP Proficient level have demonstrated competency over challenging material, including the subject matter knowledge needed, as well as applying that knowledge to real-world situations. It is not necessarily the same as being on grade level in your state, but it is a critically important standard. So let's look at the distribution of student scores for mathematics here. What we're seeing is, unfortunately, compared to 2019, fewer students are reaching the NAEP Proficient bar, and fewer students are reaching even the NAEP Basic bar in both 4th and 8th grade mathematics. But consistent with the national trends at 4th grade average scores increasing, we do see more promising signs of progress in the percentage of students scoring at NAEP Proficient and above in 4th grade math. The picture in reading is more concerning. Consistent with the steady declines that we've seen in reading nationally since 2017, We see only about 1/3 of 4th and 8th graders are reaching the NAEP proficient bar in reading here. Furthermore, 40% of 4th graders and 33% of 8th graders failed to meet the NAEP basic threshold. At 8th grade, that's the largest percentage in the 35-year history of this assessment. To make this more concrete, students who don't reach the NAEP basic level in 4th grade can't determine the meaning of familiar words using context clues. And 8th graders who fail to reach the NAEP basic level can't determine the main idea of a text. These are critically important skills that students need in reading comprehension in order to be prepared for other subject areas and other grade levels. All right, we've looked at the national picture. I want to dig in on the state data at a very high level and help you see how results varied across states. We talk about the national averages, but that really masks a lot of variation that's happening across the country. So I'll do this in two ways. First, I want to share changes between 2022 and 2024. Then I'll show you changes from 2019 to 2024. So you can see that sort of pre-pandemic period until now. So here, looking at 2022 to 2024, you'll see there was some improvement in 15 states in 4th grade math, reflecting the national trends we saw on that assessment. It's important to note that in most of these cases, these gains were driven by gains for high-performing students. Where we see declines, they tended to be driven by score declines for lower-performing students. In the other states on the screen, so the blue states are the ones where we saw these increases in 4th grade mathematics. States that are grayed out indicated that there were no statistically significant differences between their scores in 2022 and 2024 on any of the assessments that we gave. States in gold indicates that there was at least one assessment for which they showed statistically significant declines from 2022 to 2024. And the number of asterisks indicates the number of assessments out of 4 that in which they had statistically significant declines. So you can see a picture of variation here, different patterns of recovery from 22 to 24. Now let's look at 2019, the 2019 to 2024 comparison. And here you see less variation. We see that every state is still below 2019 levels in at least one of the 4 subjects and grades on the NAEP assessment. Only 2 states have surpassed their 2019 scores in a single subject and grade. And so these are some important bright spots that we want to point out, that we want to talk about amid a pretty difficult national picture. Louisiana surpassed its 4th grade reading scores from 2019 by a significant number of points in 2024. And in Alabama, they achieved the same really important feat of surpassing their 2019 scores, in this case in 4th grade mathematics. Now I want to talk about another way to look at this data. And that is, just as these national averages mask variation among states, we know that average scores mask differences for different subgroups of students. And there's many ways to look at subgroups on an assessment. You can look at racial and ethnic groups. You can look at economic disadvantage. You can look at students by their English learner status or whether they receive special education services. But the biggest gap that we are seeing on NAEP and have seen since about 2013 is different trends, different trajectories for students who are at the higher performing levels versus those students at the lower performing levels. And we continue to see that in NAEP in 2024. And you see here, each of the colored bars indicates a year in which the NAEP grade 4 reading assessment was administered. And the results are broken out by students scoring at the 10th percentile, 25th percentile, students at the average, students at the 75th, and those at the 90th percentile. And you see on the on the left-hand side of the chart that students in the lower performing groups showed significant declines year after year in this more than a decade. Whereas students on the higher end of the performance distribution showed steady increases, a little bit of a dip during COVID, especially at the 75th percentile, and then relatively flat or even increasing performance since then. This trend plays out in every single state. It looks a little bit different depending on the state's overall trend. In some cases, lower performing students are maybe holding steady. They're not increasing, but they're not losing ground. Whereas the higher performing students might be doing really, really great and sort of raising the state's average. In other places, we see lower performing students declining precipitously, whereas their higher performing peers are holding steady or even increasing. So it's really important to dig under the hood here and look at these trends for your own state. All right, that's really hard news to take in. So I do want to remind us that progress is possible, that we have seen it on NAEP. We've seen it for the nation from about 2002 to about 2011 or 13. We were reporting gains, steady gains for the nation in all subjects and grades. More gains in mathematics and reading, but steady progress. And we see this in certain states. When you dig beneath the hood and you look at the results for states like Mississippi or Louisiana or Tennessee or the District of Columbia, you see progress being made over certain periods of time for all student groups, not just the higher performers. So I want to remind us of that and just share two examples before I hand it over to Claus to lead the panel discussion. So first, I want to showcase these two bright spots in this year's data. And the first is Louisiana. And this is their grade for reading trajectory on the left, and the national trend on the right. And you can just see very, very easily visually how different the pattern is, how different the direction is for Louisiana's reading scores than for the nation. They made significant progress between 2019 and 2024, when the nation was steadily declining. And they really bucked this national trend. In mathematics, in fourth grade mathematics, we see a somewhat similar story for Alabama, where their students between 2019 and 2024 are up 6 points from where they were prior to the pandemic. Whereas nationally, we see students really take a big dip from 2019 to 2022 and a small rebound in 2024. And I think this means for the first time ever, Alabama's fourth grade math students are now scoring at the national average. So they not only are they improving, but they've really tremendously improved their performance relative to peer states. Finally, before we hear from the fantastic state leaders who are with us today about how they use NAEP, I want to briefly remind you of some of the ways that you can look at this data to help advance outcomes for children in your communities. I think the first is understanding NAEP in context with your state assessments. Both are critically important tools, and understanding how similar the story is really important, as well as understanding where there are differences and sort of interrogating that and understanding why. Obviously, you can use this assessment to compare results to states that look like you, states that have similar populations, states that have similar industries and workforce needs. You can use this to create conversations. And I think it's so wonderful that ECS is creating this opportunity to talk across state lines about where there is progress, what's working, and why. And I want to encourage you very much to look at your lower performing students' trends, both on NAEP and in your state assessments. We don't typically think of achievement gaps in that context. We typically think about them in the context of different student groups based on demographics. But this is the achievement gap that we need to focus our attention on, this disturbingly large and growing gap between lower performing and higher performing students. And then finally, I know this is one of Klaus's favorite things. NAEP includes contextual data and surveys of students, teachers, and administrators that helps you get a better understanding of important factors related to students' educational experiences that can shed light on some of the patterns and trends we're seeing. So with that, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I'd like to pass the podium over to Claus to lead the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lesley. And yes, I do love those contextual questions, as you know. Really delighted to welcome such a distinguished panel to have this conversation today. We have Aimee Guidera, who is Secretary of Education for Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. We have Tammi Hiler, Special Advisor for K-12 and Early Childhood to Colorado Governor Jared Polis, and Representative Mark White, who chairs the House Education Administration Committee for the Tennessee House of Representatives. And I should note that Representative White is also a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, which oversees NAEP. So let's jump right into it. You have all had your own state assessments. You've all seen results on those assessments before these NAEP results came out. So the question is, what did you learn from the 2024 National Report Card that may have surprised you, maybe given you some optimism or some cause for concern? And let me start with Secretary Guidera.
So Claus, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. And thanks so much to both NAGB and ECS for sponsoring this. I just want to reiterate what Lesley just ended on, which is there's so much learning that can happen, and the ability to look across the nation and say who is doing things in a way that we need to learn from is incredibly important for all of us as policymakers on this webinar. And it's the first thing that my boss always asks me. Governor Youngkin will say, where are we and who's doing it better than we are across the nation, and how do we learn from them and put that into a Virginia way of doing it. So I really want to thank both of your organizations for helping us to learn from each other, and to pause and highlight how this data can also lead to conversations about improvement for all of our students across the country. So it's great to be here. So as heartbreaking as this data is, to all of us, especially in Virginia, when we did our announcement last week, we also weren't surprised. We had been watching this over the years. The 22 NAEP data, just to give everyone context, in Virginia, which has always been considered having a really strong education system, had the country's largest learning loss in fourth grade for both reading and math, basically erasing 2 decades of progress that we had in Virginia. And this was all reinforced with our SOL scores, or standard of learning assessments that we do, our summative assessments. And so there's not surprise, because as with many of you in states, we actually had another snapshot, dipstick, if you're old like me, a dipstick view of where we were with our statewide data last May. And this data, as everyone knows, is from actually January and February of last year. So we had already another data point to look at and to see this. And we're just not moving fast enough, right? We all know that. I think this is a moment for us to say we're not doing enough, and we need to watch those states that are doing it. So there weren't surprises. There were a couple of things that I want to highlight that we saw as bright spots in a moment. But what we also know is that, immediately the governor, working in partnership with our General Assembly, when we realized the magnitude of this learning loss, also worked to put into place many interventions and putting resources in that were going to be targeted to what the data told us. And I think this is another important theme for us to talk about NAEP. I'm a data junkie, and data matters. And just collecting data and doing these dipsticks or these snapshots don't really matter if we don't ask the question of, so what does this data tell us? And now what are we going to do differently? And what we've done in Virginia is made a commitment to saying, where are we failing our children? In what school divisions? Where are they? Who are they? And how do we make sure that we have the data drive what we're going to be doing? How do we also use evidence and research to also help inform how we're going to approach this learning loss and the recovery? And how do we also make sure that our resources follow where the data tells us we need to do it the most? So I'll just quickly say that, working in partnership, the governor and the General Assembly pulled together a package of $418 million that would go out to all school divisions. And it had for 3 things. One, to expedite our Virginia Literacy Act, so that focus on reading and teaching the science of reading would happen earlier. And I'll just do a shout out of thanks to Mississippi. And it's because of NAEP and the ability to benchmark across that we all now are following that Mississippi, I won't say miracle, because they did a lot of hard work on it, but how do we learn from what Mississippi did? And I think so many of us are putting our laws into place to make sure we can get those results as well. But it was also making sure, as we knew from the research and the evidence, a lot of it from Tom Kane, telling us that intensive, consistent tutoring in the subjects where students were behind were necessary every week. And so we sent those dollars out, and then it was also a focus on chronic absenteeism of how do we do that. What we know from our May assessment data from last year is that the school divisions that are starting and had started earlier and had been more consistent about how they implemented those programs that they had said they were going to do are actually starting to see the biggest increases in student achievement, both in reducing chronic absenteeism and also starting to get some better increases in terms of math and reading. So our hope is, as more and more of our school divisions are with fidelity putting in place these programs, that we hope that in this spring we will actually see more and more better outcomes, even though We are also in the moment that we have raised all of our expectations. We've redone all of our standards. We have a whole new accountability system. We're in the business right now of updating our proficiency scores. So it may look different because we're going to have different, we're basically cranking up expectations. So the scores may not go up, but we know that our children will be getting more recovery on that. I'm happy to talk about the happy surprises after my fellow colleagues talk about it, but that was just a sense of not surprised, and yet hard at work, and we are hoping that we will see more increases as these investments we're making of time, energy, and money start to pay off.
Thanks very much, Secretary Guidera. So, I mean, a lot of important context there. You're part of a whole ecosystem of information and data that is deriving your action. I wanted to turn it maybe to you, Representative White, to see what it looks like in Tennessee. What resonates with you from what you just heard from Virginia? What other types of things would you like to add?
Absolutely, and thank you very much. Nice to be with everyone. Yes, in Tennessee, we actually look at we anxiously await the NAEP scores to come out each year. I kind of look at it like a Christmas morning. We want to know, because in Tennessee we have worked very, very hard. I've been in the General Assembly now for 15 years in Tennessee. Been chairing the Education Committee for the past 10 years, working very hard. Reason NAEP is so important to us, and knowing what the rest of the nation is doing. Before 2007, we didn't have high standards in our classrooms, and we were telling our parents and our students that our students about 96% proficient. But when we compared the NAEP scores, we were only at 34%, 1 out of 3. So we got busy as a state under the last 2 governors, and we started to adopt higher standards, college and career ready. And by 2017, according to NAEP scores, we were honored with the classification, the fastest improving state in the nation in education. Now, the key word there is improving. We have had a long way to go, still have a long way to go, but we know that we were on the right track due to NAEP. Once we hit the pandemic, and in 2021, the governor called us back into session in January 2021, because we knew with our students being out, we'd have a learning loss. And so we passed the learning loss bill, which we returned as a state back to the science of reading and phonics. We require our universities to teach those young people in the major in education to learn how to teach phonics. Plus, we also retrained all of our current teachers in phonics. Plus, we use the ESSER money for the last couple of summers in tutoring and in summer school to catch up. Where we are this year, we took this as showing that we were really on the right track, even though we were kind of one of the states that we were holding our own. We had a point or two here in advancement, but we didn't slide backwards. Actually, what we did, we're in the mid-20s now, I think 24, 25 out of 50 states in 4th and 8th grade reading and math, right around that area. And the reason we kind of advanced some there is because some other states did slide backwards, and which pushed us up more towards the top. So we took the current NAEP scores in 2024 as a lesson, and that we feel like we are on the right track. We're continuing to push forward with the higher standards, and we just anxiously wait as we move forward. I think we're on the right track, and a lot of work to do, but we feel good about it.
Thanks very much. And so, it's important. I think you bring out the notion of comparison with other states, sort of to give you a sense of what your efforts have been able to bring you, even as you try to make much more progress. I wanted to turn it, Ms. Hiler, to you. You've heard from your colleagues in other states right now. What's happening in Colorado? Do you still have this? Is this comparative analysis especially important as you think about your policy decisions in the state?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really great and always helpful for me to be able to hear from my colleagues as well. I am Tammi Hiler. I'm the governor's education advisor and have been in this role now since 2022. So I've had the benefit of working with Governor Polis now for 2 NAEP releases back in 2022, and then obviously the releases last week. I think that a lot of what my colleagues on this call have said are very similar to the sort of reactions that we have had in Colorado, seeing our NAEP scores. I think in Colorado in particular, one of the things that we have been able to do is take a look at our own state assessment, the Colorado Measures of Academic Success, or CMAS, and actually see that there was very close alignment between sort of the recent CMAS results that we saw here in Colorado with the results that we just saw from NAEP. So I'll echo that while these results overall are sobering in many ways, I would say that they also were not surprising, which in some ways I think is an indicator that the state assessments that we have are valuable tools in those in-between years that we should be using, and of course are even, taking a larger snapshot beyond just 4th and 8th grade that can be very instructive in the state. But in particular, what we've seen is that, our math scores continue to rebound a little bit more quickly than reading, similar to the national trends. We also saw some early indicators that we may be seeing some declines in our 4th grade reading scores. But I think the biggest story in Colorado and is sort of the red flashing light of where we need to now focus our attention is around the sort of pervasive achievement gaps that we know continue to exist and widen in some ways between students from different races or income levels, as well as, disability status. Those are the kinds of conversations and questions that we now are going to need to be digging in more deeply and trying to understand and learn from other states who may not have seen as much widening in those gaps. Since we've only had our data now for the current data for about a week, obviously we don't have a totally fleshed out plan for exactly what that is going to look like. But I can use 2022 as a good example of how we used the NAEP scores here in Colorado to really institute some significant changes, specifically around math. So in 2022, we saw that our NAEP scores in math, while Colorado was still technically above the national average in some of the scale scores, that's pretty typical here in Colorado, we saw that our declines were faster than other states and weren't seeing that type of decline as quickly in reading, but knew that as a state back in 2012, we had made pretty significant changes to reading, making literacy a focus, passed a law called the READ Act, even went back in 2019 and updated that to really be reflective of the science of reading. But we sort of recognized that as a state, we had not gone through the same kind of comprehensive review of math. And so Governor Polis, along with the legislator and a lot of state partners sort of said, we need to make that a big focus. And we're able to make very significant investments around out of school time and making sure that out of school time and math tutoring was widely available to all states, purchasing statewide digital math accelerator licenses that were free and available to all elementary and middle schools across the state. We actually went through our state statute and found places where we had called out reading and made sure that we included math as part of that. So that looked at our educator preparation standards and the things that we were expecting of incoming teachers and what they needed to be looking at. It actually also touched on some of our early childhood statutes and making sure that in addition to early literacy, early numeracy was something that we needed our classrooms and programs to be focusing on. And so I think similar to what Representative White just shared, while we haven't seen the huge payout from those investments in 2022, what is extremely heartening to us is that we're not seeing declines. We're seeing that the trends are moving in the right direction. And that is an indication to us that, we need to sort of stay the course and continue to build on those investments and to make sure that we're, now using this year's scores to once again understand and see where else can we turn the dials and learn from other states. So, I think I echo others and am happy to share other bright spots and, some of the conversations that we intend to have and want to have in the coming weeks and months as our legislative session is just getting underway.
Claus, can I jump in and just build on
Yes,
what
please.
about the bright spots? And so that to me is one of the most important things, is looking and digging into the data to say, so what did we do that's now working a little bit that we can see? We can't say it's causal, right? We can say it's there's something there though. And so I share this not in that here is the answer and what happened, but to build on what Tammi just said and how important it is for all of us to also just keep track of what we're changing and the impact it's having, so we can do some more studies on it. But there's a couple of bright spots. One of the things that when we launched our education agenda, this high expectations agenda in 2022, you had high expectations at the top of our guiding principles, but we also said we were going to prioritize resources to the students, schools, and communities who need it the most, and we were going to use data to do that. And so we've been prioritizing resources, tools, thinking about how do we meet those populations who have been historically underserved and whose results we've all been watching and worried about. And I want to give you a couple bright spots in Virginia because, like Tammy mentioned, we were being really discerning about how do we make sure that when we did tutoring, we had a learning as we used some ESSER dollars to do a learning acceleration grant, and we made sure that half of the money of those millions of dollars were targeted to our most economically disadvantaged students. What I can tell you is that our economically disadvantaged students are one of our bright spots. In fourth grade reading, they scored 9 points higher than they did earlier. And that they increased on NAEP proficient by 5 percentage points. So we're seeing some bright spots within populations we're worried about. And I won't read all this data to you, but we also know in fourth grade, our English language learners did better. Our Black students reduced the performance gap with white peers. Students with disabilities also increased their level of NAEP proficiency. So it also, for me, says it matters to look at this data and to break it down and not use averages, right? And that's the other important piece around any of our data points, whether they be our state test or a NAEP, is to break it down. And as Lesley showed us, looking at specific student groups and then in our own, encouraging our schools also. And we've made a huge push in helping our teachers, our parents, our students themselves have access to that student level data so that we really have a sense of where individual students are and what they need, and then targeting the interventions to that with proven interventions, but doing the same thing with these cohorts. And I think it is just important to note that we're just starting to dig into this, identifying what's working, showing these promising trends. And then, as my colleagues have both said, it's how do we continue the work that we're doing, because I think it is working, and the data shows that that we're on the right track, and that we will start seeing better results and outcomes as a result of keeping the course and keep doing this.
Well, thanks to all of you for addressing that notion of bright spots, because I think sometimes we hear people talk about bright spots as if that were a way of avoiding some of the more serious and troubling, results that you have in an assessment. But the idea of bright spots is that you're trying to find areas and evidence of what seems to be working and how you can double down on those kinds of things and learn from them. So it's information rather than just a communication strategy. So I think that's a really important point. I want to remark very briefly, I know we've got a bunch of questions pouring in. I'm looking over here at our Q&A, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end. So please be patient. Feel free to add to those questions. I wanted to address something sort of that's been embedded in a lot of your conversation remarks so far, and that is the different roles that you serve, right? We've talked about what governors are doing. We've talked about what's happening in legislatures. We've talked about actions that have been undertaken by agencies. And so I was wondering, since we have, a reasonably diverse representation on this call right now of your own roles, and that's something that ECS is really proud of, that we bring people from various state policymaking roles together. How do you work across these different role groups in order to be able to respond to the kinds of information you're getting from NAEP, and even across things like political lines and divisions in this sort of very intense period? How does that work for you? And maybe we can start with Representative White.
Well, thank you. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges, especially when you serve in an elected position in the General Assembly, when you got so many. Kind of reminds me of the story you learned as a child, where there's 7 men standing around an elephant, and some are standing by the tail, by the leg, or the trunk, and or by the ear. You describe it different, depends on where you're coming. So as a role as a state legislator, how you pull people together to make sure that we're moving forward. I always tell everybody one of the best things I did for myself years ago is go back and get a master's degree in conflict management resolution. It really taught me so much on how you negotiate and bring people together, because most of the time we're saying the same thing. About 80% of the time we're saying the same thing. We're just not listening to each other. We're saying it in a different way. Quick story, in committee last year, I had recognizing my committee members, and we were talking about a particular bill. And the Democrats and Republicans were going back and forth. And after about 10 minutes, I gavelled and I says, "Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, do you realize you're saying the same thing? You're just saying it in a different way." And they said, "No, we're not." "No, but actually we are, if we would just listen to each other." So being able to bring people together to a common goal is probably one of the biggest challenges right now, and everything, because we're all over the map on public education, private education, homeschooling charters. We're a state. Last week we went into special session. Governor Lee, our current governor, is a large advocate of the education freedom scholarships. And so we did pass that bill last week. So we have joined that group of states in on that. So there's just a lot of issues out there, but being able to work and listen, I think that's the biggest thing. Is one of our famous senators, Howard Baker, used to say, "No one's completely right, and the other guy may be right." So you listen, but then moving forward, you got to keep moving forward with what you believe is working, and so that's kind of how I handle things here in my role.
Thanks very much. And so I might also bring that same question, you as a legislator, bring that to Ms. Hiler as someone working in a governor's office. How do you work with the legislatures and governors?
Sure. And, if anyone's heard Governor Polis speak, he's said this across many issue areas, right? But he's always saying no one state, no one political party has a monopoly on good ideas. And I think that's really, really important to bring to the forefront, especially when we're talking about some of these issues, that can bubble up in education, that can, feel like we're drawing partisan lines, when really at the end of the day, we know that there is a lot of bipartisan consensus. There is a lot of agreement on what we want the outcomes and goals to be. And I'd say that that's a highlight, and why, the NAEP assessment, an objective assessment like this that comes out every 2 years and really gives us some of that comparable data is such an important tool for us to be able to sort of ground the conversations that we need to be having in a state, in the data that we're actually seeing. And I'll also just say that that's part of the reason why many of you are aware that Governor Polis right now is serving as the chair of the National Governors Association, and as chair could select any one issue that he wanted to work on for the year, and wanted to choose education as that sort of topic. And in particular, thinking about how states can better be measuring outcomes to ensure that students are ready, for post-secondary, college and career readiness, et cetera. And so, I'll say that just, is probably the case in every state. So much of what's important in making sure you're having progress is making sure everyone has a seat at the table. I'll say right now, as a state, similar to as Secretary Guidera mentioned, we're also going through a process of sort of looking at our accountability system. But this is not something that has happened overnight. This has taken many years. We've had task forces where we're bringing every diverse viewpoint to the table to really come to consensus around what are some of the recommendations that we can move forward. And knowing that we have that buy-in and have that to fall back on always is making the conversation earlier. So as we're pushing through some really hard conversations this year in Colorado, we feel good that we have that sort of at the center, and that will sort of continue to be the approach that we want to take, and making sure, once again, I'm mentioning, right, no one party has a monopoly on good ideas, and how we can learn from one another, both within our state and in our local communities, but then of course looking to other states across the nation and seeing how we can replicate what is working.
Thank you very much. And so I might just turn to Secretary Guidera with the same question. Working across role groups, I think you're in an interesting role that's not in every state, that gives you some, multiple perspectives on how you work with other policymakers within a state to focus on data and evidence, and is really important. And then I think we're going to have to break to help deal with the questions that have been pouring in on our Q&A.
Great. I'll just be real fast and say my favorite Deming quote is, "In God we trust and all others bring data." And I think that's so true when we're talking specifically around a change management issue. And that's what we're all dealing with, all of us, right? We are trying to working together through many, many different stakeholders, but also critical players, legislators, state boards. In my case, as Claus just said, the Secretary of Education of Virginia oversees education for early learning, K-12, 2-year and 4-year. It's about how do we harness all those resources and get everyone rowing in the same direction. And in our mind, it's about readiness for life. And how do we make sure that everybody is talking about that, but also it's grounded in data. And I find if change management is dependent on people having an awareness for a need to change, a desire to change, and a knowledge how to change, data is critical to all of that. And I would encourage all of us to use this data in NAEP as a huge wake-up call to, one, bring our public stakeholders along and have them realize that this is also a culture change of high expectations, right? This is about kids need to be in school to learn. We know that the pandemic was horrific. And we also know that there was also a lowering of expectations, at least in Virginia, I think several other places before the pandemic, that lowered cut scores, and then we kept our schools closed. So part of this is a reset towards a culture of high expectations, and that needs to happen everywhere, including around dinner tables and conversations, and the role of data and helping people to understand where we are and where our children are, and that we're at risk of losing a generation of kids is an important part about how do we change hearts and minds. And we use this data to inform discussions, but most importantly, to inform actions. And those actions, as both my colleagues have said, are dependent on people working together and having a shared view of what success is and then what we need to do together to get there. So it's a moment, right? This is a moment, and these NAEP scores are really important for us to sit down and work together to get better outcomes.
Thank you very much, Secretary Guidera. No, and it's music, of course, to our ears at ECS, because we believe that precisely those kinds of collaborations across various role groups, we're all sort of pulling in the same direction, is critical. Now, I did want to start addressing audience questions, so I will shift to that. It's an embarrassment of riches here, more than we can possibly talk about. But I did want to sort of very quickly note that some people asked, "Well, is this recorded?" It will be recorded, and you'll be able to get recordings of this session. But let me first actually throw a question from our list here over to Lesley Muldoon regarding whether there are assessments in other areas. I've seen questions about science. I've seen questions about the arts. And sorry to pull you out of, there you are. Okay.
No, that's great. Thanks, Claus. NAEP assesses, assesses subjects outside of reading and math, certainly. We also conducted, at the same time as the reading and math assessments that we just talked about, we also conducted grade 12 reading and mathematics at the national level and 8th grade science at the national level. Those results will be released later this year. We are in our next assessment cycle in 2026. We expect to assess history and civics at the national level in grade 8 as well. NAEP used to also assess the arts, geography, and economics. Those assessments we could not maintain them during the transition from paper and pencil testing to digital assessment and due to budget. So unfortunately, we no longer assess those subjects, which I know was a question in the chat.
Thanks very much for that. So yeah, it's always important to remember what the cadence and number of these assessments are. I know I follow that religiously because, it is really helpful to know exactly when we can expect the next burst of data on something really important. As I said, there are very many questions here. I did want to address one that I'm going to sort of summarize quickly. There was a comment that reading has been flat over so many years, and all this despite the fact that there's been so much investment in reading, particularly in more recent years. We did hear about Alabama and Louisiana, but could the panelists sort of reflect a little bit on why that might be and how you're trying to turn that corner? You've addressed it to some degree already, but I'll open that to anyone who wants to leap onto it.
I'll jump in.
Great.
Yeah, as far as reading, we're looking at it like in Tennessee, we actually passed a couple years ago a third grade retention bill, which is we should call it a third grade intervention by retention. We got a tremendous amount of pushback, but we modeled it after the Mississippi model. At the time, Carrie Wright, the superintendent of schools down there, she came up and spoke to our committee also, and how important it is to focus. No one wants to hold back an 8-year-old at that point in time because of reading or any other issue, but we did so just to make sure that we are focused on the importance of reading. And I give a plug in. We are very fortunate to have in our state Dolly Parton in the Imagination Library, which does a lot of focus on early childhood reading in the early years. So having done there, also a lot of looking at the scores. If you go back and look at the NAEP results back in 2010 is when we started going down. From 1970 all the way up to 2010, we were advancing and then 2010 we started slowly going down. And I believe one of those we've got a bill before us this year, and many states have already done this, is that we make sure that the smartphone, which has social media on it, is not present during the instructional hours. So we're going to take a hard look at that. Many of our schools have already done this. I think that has possibly damaged their early years in reading also.
I'll jump in on that one, Claus. I don't know. Just to say a ditto to that, and Representative, we are really proud that in Virginia, we instituted as of January 1st of this year that bell-to-bell cell phone free education is the rule of the land across all of our schools in Virginia. And the stories we're hearing out of schools, parents, students, where they have been doing this for a while, and we learn from them, is just incredible, the stories. And I think anybody, and what Jonathan Haidt said when he was here talking with the First Lady in September, is that he doesn't know a single person who has been involved in this, that after a week of having a bell-to-bell cell phone free education in a school says, boy, that was a bad idea. And again, I don't want to prognosticate on here, but my hope is that I look at this data, that when all of us put down our phones more and start role modeling that picking up a book, picking up something to read is what we all should be doing more of, our children will see that, and the fact that we have just given everyone permission to focus on learning while they're in school, and hopefully we're doing the same thing at home with our children, that we can have that culture change that says this is part of what we do. We read, we don't scroll all day long. So I'm really hopeful that this is something that as a nation we're going to turn the page on.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary.
Please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I also wanted to jump in just from Colorado's perspective too, and something that, I hope a takeaway from this data is not that, all of the efforts in recent years around the science of reading were for naught, and that, we need to scrap all of that and start over. I think, and hopefully what we've seen here in Colorado and other states have seen, is that some of these interventions certainly take time to build up. And as I mentioned before, we had a law that was passed in 2012 that we had to revisit and tweak and make sure that, for example, every single teacher in the state, K through 3, was actually trained on the science of reading. And that took a lot of hard work. It was not the easiest thing to get through. And now we're starting to see, hopefully, that implementation, especially in our 8th grade reading scores, where we saw sort of a trend upward, whereas the national trend in 8th grade reading went down, that those efforts are paying off. So I would just make a push that while of course you should use this data and make necessary adjustments, it's also important to sort of stay the course and make sure that you're building on things that you've already done, not necessarily just having whiplash every 2 years when a new set of data comes out. I'll also say that, we passed universal preschool here in Colorado. We're in our 2nd year of full implementation, right? And so we haven't seen the spoils of that labor yet either. And hopefully over time, we will start to see how that is impacting some of the early literacy and 4th grade reading scores that we're seeing in the state. So just saying that at times states need to play a little bit of that long game as well.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I think that's important when you look at trend data too, to remember that you don't want to be hopping from policy to policy, but you need to play that longer game. I did want, I know we're getting tight on time, but there's a very interesting question, Secretary Guidera. I'm going to direct it to you just for time's sake. The question is, could you share the kind of data you use to show your progress, and if money is being used to enhance it? It mentions a state that struggles with having so many data points that it's difficult to sort of narrow into what those accurate stories are that are actually things you can act on.
So in the name of time, first I wanted to underscore what Tammi just said. It is so important that it's not, we need a new program. If it's based on data and it's working, keep it going. It's good. So the real quick thing, if the person who asked the question wants to learn more, please go to the Virginia Department of Education VDOE website and look at our school performance and support framework. What we have done, this is our new accountability system, and what it does is provide better than we've ever had, best-in-class transparency around how well every school is serving every student. And the focus on resources being allocated to it is that why the name is a performance and support framework is that we are trying to we're trying to provide complete transparency around school performance. And we're doing it in a way that's not about shaming and blaming, but it is about so that we can identify schools that need extra supports and then making it possible for them to have access to that. And our goal is to have every school be a distinguished school. And so if you go on there and look at it, you can see how we're defining what it is, but our whole concept has been readiness for life. How do we make sure, readiness for life is different and what needs to happen for readiness of elementary school into middle school? There's a whole readiness measurement that you can go and see exactly what's part of that from middle school into high school, and then readiness for life beyond high school. And we're putting a priority on being able to measure not just things like our old accountability system did of graduation, but and attendance, but also looking at proficiency, right? Really looking at proficiency and not just growth. Both of those things matter, but we've got to talk about proficiency, which is what NAEP is also all about. But it's also measuring things that we know give signals that you are ready to enroll in a job, and enroll further education, get employed in a job, or enlist in the military. And so things like industry recognized credentials, college credit in our most in-demand areas of study, things like that, we're baking into that and providing that data and being able to also see school by school who is preparing our students best to be ready for the next thing at every level. And I encourage people to take a look at it and would love to hear feedback from you all.
Thanks very much, Secretary Guidera. It is 3:58. I was so eager to ask one more question, but I don't think I can do that and honor all of our time. So what I do want to do is just thank you all so much for participating. I think the fact that we have 26 questions here shows just how much eagerness there is to engage with this information and to get more. So, we will have, as I mentioned, this recording available to all of you afterwards. And I just wanted to thank everyone for participating today. And, sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but really appreciate the time you all joined us. And I also want to actually ask for a huge round of virtual applause, which none of us will hear, for our presenters, because they really took the time to provide a lot of valuable insights today. I also want to thank all of our sponsors and partners across the education spectrum who make this kind of thing possible. We're very, very pleased to be able to bring you all together through these Partnering for Success webinars, which provide solutions and real insights into some of today's most pressing education policy issues. And so each of these partners has had a commitment to collaboration and innovation to pave the way to meaningful improvements. And of course, when we're talking about partners, we just want to be so very thankful to the National Assessment Governing Board, led by Lesley, Muldoon, who made all of this possible. Thanks also to this audience. And we also want you to remember that Education Commission of the States is here to support you in our work. And to remember that the next Partnering for Success webinar is focused on the governor's State of the State addresses, and that's scheduled for March 19th. So keep your eye out for registrations that will open in mid-February. Those tend to fill up really fast. So get in early, but we will record that session as well. So we really hope that you're taking away at least one important idea from today's webinar that your state can draw on. I know that there are going to be more of these webinars that NAGB is doing with various partners, and I think they're extremely valuable. But if you have any questions or requests related to today's session, please reach out to me. I am going to be adding my email to the chat, but I'm not sure you'll see it. But you can find me on the Education Commission of the State's website. So please just make sure if you have questions to get in touch. Thank you again.